So it's
Oh,
live.
that was crazy. I haven't used Zoom before, so I'm not used to the whole.
That's the thing. Do you remember Mike and James talking about, whoa,
Yeah, I do.
this is this. And now you have the experience.
Indeed, yeah, that makes sense now.
So how have you been? You asked me how am I? I'm perfect. Thanks for the question. How have you been in the last few weeks, few months since we've seen each other? Like,
Yeah, I've been pretty good. As you mentioned earlier, I did my first bodybuilding show, which was hard. But since then, I've been a lot better. So can't complain.
what's been hard? What's been the hardest?
Towards the end, everything was hard. Like in my head, it would always be a checklist of, okay, what boxes do I need to tick? It would be doing my steps, so getting my NEAT out of the way, doing my posing, which towards the end was, I was so tired, doing posing was difficult, obviously, and training. And the last like 2 weeks of training before the show, I got very concerned about injury because you just feel brittle and weak, sort of thing. So you're trying to do your best to get effective sessions in, to not get injured, but at times it does get pretty scary.
Pretty
So
scary. Like, can you tell us what would you do different? What was your biggest mistake? Kind of worrying too much, or some other
I
technical
mean,
aspect?
certainly it would have been better to not worry as much, but I don't think that's entirely under control. Um, I think generally starting my prep a little bit earlier, but I think that's something a lot of first-time competitors make the mistake of doing, is that they start too late. It's always hard to gauge just how much weight you should be losing to look your best on stage. Um, so yeah, I'd say starting my prep a little bit earlier, um, losing weight more aggressively at the beginning and less aggressively towards the end. So just making sure that as I got closer and closer to the stage, I slowed down my rate of weight loss, because towards the very end, you know, you're not in a very good position to be retaining muscle mass. It's quite easy to lose muscle mass. So I think starting earlier would have been good.
I love to see these numbers always. So mathematically speaking, you're losing one kilo in the, let's say, 6th percentile body fat. It's a larger chunk of the whole body fat than like if you're 15 or even 20-30%. So it's much harder mathematically speaking. I want to ask, you have been training how much till this bodybuilding show? Because you looked awesome. There is improvement. You see that there is a lot of room for improvement. How much mass phases did you had prior to this bodybuilding show?
Prior to it, I mean, I've been training for 7-8 years total now.
Mm-hmm.
So, and most of the time was spent massing. When I started lifting, I was 14 years old, 6'2", and I must have weighed around 140 pounds, maybe around there. And I weighed in on stage at around 200 pounds. So like the vast majority of my time spent lifting was spent massing, except for, you know, the infamous summer cuts where you just try and lose some fat before summer to look good on the beach. So yeah, I'd say probably around 6 years of massing and like a year and a half of cutting or something like that total.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
But let's say in a different parallel universe, what would happen if you did recomp the whole time, like gaintained? How would you look on stage after this time, the same amount of time?
I mean, if I just gaintained, you can't gaintain infinitely. Like I wouldn't have gotten to stage lean anyways, because if you just maintain, I'm not going to get to 3% body fat just gaintaining. But hey, assuming I would have been able to, I would have been around 140 pounds on stage, which, you know, not the best look at 6'2".
Let's talk about technique and the execution, especially let's start maybe at squats. First of all, I saw one time you doing a split squat. The front foot was elevated, obviously, to make the range of motion bigger. We're going to talk about range of motion maybe later on, but what's the difference between one-legged and bilateral stand squat, so two-legged stand squat?
Yeah, so I think split squats or single leg squat, I guess, in that sense, have certain benefits. One would be reduced actual loading. So your lower back is a lot less recruited, or there's a lot less demand for spinal extension, simply put, because you're essentially lifting around half the weight, a bit more than half the weight that you would be for squats. Because if you account for your body weight, you're still lifting a decent amount. But if you're doing, say, split squats with 20 kilograms versus squats with 140, it's still a lot less weight, around half. But ultimately, both sides of your lower back are still active. So while you're essentially doubling the stress or the demands on one leg and making it effective, you're not doubling the demands on your lower back. You're essentially halving it. So you're making it effective for each leg while making it a lot less demanding on your lower back. That's the long and short of it. Which means if you have a lower back injury or your program is already especially heavy on lower back demanding exercises like RDLs, like squats, like deadlifts in general, then adding in some split squats for extra glute and quad work can be quite helpful. Another benefit can be the obvious one that a lot of bodybuilders talk about, which is fixing asymmetries in muscle size. If you find that you have, I don't know, one leg that's bigger than the other or one glute, then it can be helpful to have some single leg work in there. Ultimately, I think it's a bit easier to get more depth with single leg or split squats usually, I'd say, compared to both leg squats. I'm not quite sure what that is. It could just be that you're able to tweak biomechanics a bit more compared to having, a free weight squat where it's a bit more difficult to stabilize and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'd say those three are main benefits.
I don't want to sound too smart, but there's some, like I said, biomechanically, we are walking like always one foot is in front of the other, and they're like, I don't know how to say it because it's 420s today. So
indeed, hey.
My mind is all somewhere up there in the sky.
Sorry, early.
But biomechanically, it's a little bit easier to do a deeper squat with a split squat, Bulgarian squat. Mike Izricanje jokingly told once, I don't know, it's like half joke, half truth. I would do my whole training like with one arm because if it didn't require the double amount of time. So
I think there is some truth to that, where obviously if you do one set of both arms versus two sets of one arm, typically two sets of one arm can take longer. However, especially with upper body, the systemic fatigue of each set is so low that you basically don't really have to rest between sets of like one arm and next. So an example, cable lateral raises. For a lot of people, they just do them single arm. And you think, oh, they're a lot less time efficient, worse stimulus to time ratio because you have two sets to do instead of one for each set, essentially. But because you barely have to rest between sets for one arm to the next, because after a set, you're not really out of breath, You're not really no synergist muscle groups are outside. I find that it doesn't take much, if any, more time typically, at least for isolation exercises. For split squats, you might find it takes a bit longer. But then again, when you compare it to high bar squats, for example, people typically rest quite long between sets of high bar squats too. And when you consider as well that split squats require much less load, and typically the more load an exercise requires, the longer it takes to warm up for, I think it's pretty equivalent. I sometimes even prefer split squats for that reason.
I love your analytical mind because you always, like I said, I was thinking about this double the time, and then I was thinking about all these things you said now. So that are some good points. And I do like lateral cable raises. I do kind of a no rest. So it's kind of a MIlo set. I do down sets as well. So I put these pink and blue 1 and 2 kilos on, and then I put 1 kilo off for the next 2 sets, and then put the 1 kilo on, the 2 kilos off, so 1 kilo again off, and I do no breaks. So it's the same amount of I feel kind of the stimulants, and in a shorter amount of times, kind of.
Definitely, yeah. I think people often overestimate how much time single leg or single arm work takes compared to both legs or both arms. And in some cases, it can be as quick or even quicker.
I have one strange case. In my case, I had a cut on my hand, on my wrist, on my palm. Sorry, see, I'm getting there. Sorry, and I had to do just with one arm. I said I will do the dumbbell with one arm, even though I did it this way. This one motion kind of was totally different. I had a totally different pump, strange. And I was thinking, is it because this arm is smaller, or am I imagining things? But it kind of was new technique, because this isn't the same as this, kind of some small tweaks. So yeah, that's one strange case in my case.
Indeed. With my muscle connection, typically it just takes a while until when you start a new exercise, you reach the same sort of my muscle connection. That's why people often suggest not switching out exercises too quickly, because if you've only done exercise once, in all likelihood, your pump won't be amazing yet. But once you do it a few times, typically your mind-muscle connection becomes at least decent. And if it still doesn't, it might be a sign that you switch.
I heard one question about the show, because I love to ask these questions. The volume during your prep and the shift. Maybe did you do a shift towards a high rep volume, or you mentioned you were chasing effective reps eventually, but without getting hurt? You were afraid.
Yeah. So towards the end, it wasn't so much effective reps as it was just effective training. So that would mean towards the end, I was doing sometimes blood flow restriction training for my arms.
What is the end? So the last meso, or?
The end was the last meso or two, yeah, like the last 5 to 10 weeks or so. Keep in mind, I started my prep officially like 6 months out, because I was quite fat. And I didn't cut the whole way. I had a maintenance phase, I had a very small bulking phase, and that sort of thing. But the last 5 to 10 weeks of hard prep is when I incorporated some intensity techniques with a lot of higher rep stuff, more machine-based work, made sure to sort of prioritize tempo over absolute load on the bar, typically, as long as it still meant I reached pretty close to failure. The thing deeper into prep that can be a bit weird is that although you should be focusing on controlling the tempo so as to minimize injury risk while still maximizing stimulus, and you still want to maintain load on the bar, because you're getting lighter and lighter and your leverages typically get worse and your technique is more strict and that sort of thing, the load on the bar goes down. So it's easy to think that you've lost a lot of muscle. And it's sort of like the thing where you don't like seeing weights go down during prep, because you think, oh, I've lost a lot of muscle mass. And it can be a bit sad towards the end, where you feel like every week you're just getting a bit weaker and smaller and weaker and smaller and weaker and smaller. But it's worth keeping in mind during prep to keep yourself sane that your technique is probably a bit stricter. You're switching to more higher rep stuff. You're more fatigued in general, and that you're not actually getting that much weaker or losing much muscle mass usually.
And peak week, what was that like? Was it like the worst of the worst? You talking about this getting weaker and stuff, because I had made one. I done one peak week. It was hell. I don't know. You feel like you're ashamed in the gym.
Oh yeah. So my peak week was fairly conservative. I just had a few lower days with lower calories and carbs, followed by a few higher days, and the last 2 days were it was essentially a front load. So I had a full week to peak, which meant that there's some benefits and drawbacks. Benefits, you get a bit longer to readjust in case it goes wrong. So the last 2 days are very flexible, depending on how you're looking a few days out. But then the drawback, for example, is that you don't have quite as long to diet as opposed to, let's say you were front loading for a full week. That means you lose out on essentially a full week of real fat loss dieting. Whereas if you're doing a backload where you're increasing carbs and calories only towards the end of that week, you still have most of that week to lose fat and weight. But I did a front load mostly because it was my second time peaking. I peaked once for some photo shoots. I did 3 photo shoots a month out. And yeah, it was okay. I think peaking is definitely harder typically for enhanced bodybuilders, just because there's a lot more restriction typically going on with water and all that sort of thing. Whereas for natural bodybuilding, typically not too much restriction of water or sodium should be going on. So for me, it was simply a matter of having some lower carb days and then some higher carb days. But it was stressful anyways, because the last week before a show typically is stressful, whatever you do.
you had it documented on YouTube. So how many videos did you record, and when did it start? It started like this year or last?
It started
year?
in 2021, in around April 2021, which was around 6 months out-ish, 5-6 months out. Mm-hmm. And I think I must have recorded around 20 videos total about prep. It was my first prep, so it was fun to have a log of it and have some people follow along.
Are you going to do it again? So are you going to compete? Or?
Which part? Compete or the video series?
Both.
Compete, most likely yes, but not for a few years. I think you really need to be in a good space as far as your mental health, as far as your setup in life goes, to do a really successful prep. So if your mental health isn't right, there's a good chance you won't have a good prep. Like if you're already too food focused going into it, if you're already diet fatigued, if you're already, let's say you have depression or anxiety to a large extent or something like that, that's not a good situation to do a prep in, because typically those things get a bit worse, I'd say, as you get closer and closer to show day. So I think you want to be in a situation where you have a lot of day-to-day consistency and reliability and not that much changes, not a lot of big life changes like moving houses or that sort of thing, because that can really throw things off pretty easily. There's a reason why deeper into prep, a lot of relationships take a hit as well, because you're not able to go out for food as much and be as sociable. And so I think you should probably have a good chunk of time in the off season usually, just to sort of help those relationships out as well, before you go back into a prep where, you know, everything takes a hit, from your social life to your libido, everything. Like, it's just not a good time. So for me, it's going to be a few more years until I compete again. Probably naturally, maybe in a few years, I'll try some enhancements, but we'll see.
To be continued. So Eric Helms told once that he guarded his food like a dog when his, I don't know, wife or girlfriend or whatever came in. So, and I had the same situation, circling back to my arm injury. So I don't want to say anything, but you have to imagine what happened between guarding food and arm injury.
Indeed, yeah,
on a restrictive diet. So I feel about the YouTube the same way. I kind of want to start. I mean, I have this obviously this podcast where I talk to people and where I don't prepare at all, except in my mind. I don't write stuff. So it's more it kind of started like with this title, Science, Nauka is Science. But it drifted more like a natural conversation, and people like that because I can be natural in my language, of course, and kind of natural in English, because you change your personality kind of when you talk in another language. We talk in German. Do you have another personality in German?
I'm a lot more reserved and shy in German, just because my German isn't as good, so I can't be as cynical or mean.
Yeah, but to be just perfectly clear for the record, your German is perfect, but you don't have the phrases and stuff like I in English, exactly. Like me in English.
I understand pretty much everything in German, but because I barely speak it nowadays, I'm just rusty, I guess.
Rusty, exactly. Let's go back to the squat and to the biomechanics of the squat. Have you studied these biomechanical? How do you leverage a squat, for example? Maybe one example would be make the Smith machine squat with feet forward. So you have much more tension, I guess, on the quads. Or do you study these techniques, biomechanics, or do you just go with the flow?
Sure. So I do understand the biomechanics of squatting to a certain extent. I think sometimes I'm reluctant to delve too deep into biomechanics because a lot of assumptions haven't been tested directly. And so it's a lot of theory crafting. For example, the relationship between EMG and growth is much more tenuous or weak than people think. And I think the same likely applies to stuff like fiber orientation and making sure that the line of pull is the same as the fiber orientation, that sort of thing. I think a lot of those assumptions make some sense theoretically, but then they haven't been tested. And so I'm a bit reluctant to rely on those too much when deciding on exercise technique. I'd rather rely on stuff like, range of motion, which has been assessed a fair amount now. to guide my exercise technique decisions, I guess. So with the squat specifically, the Smith machine feet forward squat is helpful in a few ways. Kind of like with the split squat, you can reduce the actual loading simply because by keeping your lower back underneath the bar and underneath the center of mass, there's very little moment arm between the center of mass and your lower back, which basically just means because your lower back is underneath the bar, it's a lot easier for your lower back.
It's stacked, so, kind of.
Exactly. Exactly. At the same time, because your knees are much further forward, looking at it from the side, your knees are much further forward compared to the bar than usual. That also means that it's a lot harder for your quads. Plus, in my experience, typically people with limited ankle mobility can get a lot more range of motion for the quads with the feet forward squat. So it's a sort of a double whammy of more range of motion for the quads, especially at the very bottom, and also the Smith machine feet forward squat makes it more likely for your quads to be the limiting factor because it's harder for them essentially because your knees are so far forward. Altogether, that just means that it's a better exercise likely than regular squats for your quads, but it's likely a worse exercise for your glutes, adductors, and lower back than regular squats. It's sort of a trade-off, I guess.
So going back to the squat again, to your squat, I can say we always, so like the whole fitness industry and most people today do this kind of wide stance, not the sumo squats, but kind of wide-ish stance, feet pointing outward squat. I did it for all my life up until recently. But just one comparison I stumbled upon. So I saw it. My vocabulary is not that good. So when you do split squats, Bulgarian split squats, your feet is forward. You're not doing this outward and you do the same, and I do the same. Like I said recently, you do a narrow stance, so narrow-ish, feet not too much outward, so it's kind of pointing forward, like in the split squat. And that's what I saw, and it was like, can you explain the reason behind this? Because I can imagine many people wrote messages to you, why is your stance so why do you do it like that?
Indeed, they often do. For a lot of people, Greg Knuckles has written about this, for example. For a lot of people, certain stances just aren't very comfortable. For me, that stance is literally just the most comfortable. I get the most range of motion for my quads. I get a deep stretch in my quads. I personally find that when my feet are pointed forward as opposed to sort of outward, I typically just get a bit more quad sensation, I guess, like my muscle connection, which is likely also beneficial. So that's the reason. I know there's some, again, kind of theory crafting around how wider stance squats might be a bit better for the glutes, whereas narrow stance might be better for the quads. Honestly, I don't know. It could be, it could not be. I think it's too early to say. For the time being, I think your best bet is selecting the stance that gives you the best range of motion and is the most comfortable and doesn't cause you any sort of pain as far as lower back, hips, knees. Because realistically, different squatting styles can have different effects on like your wrist pain, your elbow pain, your shoulder pain, your knee pain, lower back pain, hip pain, and so forth. Like when I'm low back squatting with a wider stance, for example, typically most joints in my body hurt. Like it's just not comfortable. Whereas if I do a high bar squat with a narrow stance, for me, it's almost pain-free, pretty much. So that's why I do it.
You mentioned ankle mobility, and people often, you see, maybe do this heels elevated squats. For example, the most common example is goblet squat and Zercher split squat. So I kind of delved in this world of this biomechanics, where different positions and different maybe ankle angles kind of manipulate how you move. So you can do a much greater range of motion, and people explain like if you do this, you have much more range of motion in your ankles. So in this, but it's not like that, because there are some people explain it. When you do this, your whole hips shift because you have shifted the stance. So kind of it's eversion and inversion, where your knees follow and your hips follow, so you can do a deeper squat. So this is one example. How important is the depth of the squat? And can you talk about the this study where they did the leg extension in the I want to know, because they did leg extension, so they went to 90 degrees or less or more than 90 degrees. Can you just explain the study?
Yeah, so regarding squats, how important do I think depth is? I think it's a bit important. Like, it's not the most important thing ever compared to, for example, volume potentially, or going close-ish to failure, or that sort of thing. But I think it's reasonably important. So regarding the study you just mentioned, there were 4 groups. There was one group that did leg extensions in the shortened range, so near lockout. One group that did leg extensions near the very lengthened range, so just the beginning of each rep, essentially. One group that did half their sets in the shortened range and half their sets in the lengthened range. And then one group that just did a full range of motion all the time. Long story short, and that was by Pedrosa et al. In 2021, I believe, with Schoenfeld involved, which is why I got a lot of publicity, I think. So long story short, what they found was, taken all together, the group doing leg extensions in the very lengthened range saw the most growth, which honestly, I wasn't too surprised by. If you look at the literature as a whole around range of motion, what you find is that doing a partial range of motion at long muscle lengths, so when a muscle group is quite stretched out, like for example, the bottom of a chest fly, like a dumbbell fly at the very bottom when you get deep stretch in your chest, a partial range of motion there tends to be pretty effective for muscle growth, especially compared to a partial range of motion near lockout, like for example, the top of a chest fly. I would put money on the fact that if I had 2 people do the same person do either long muscle length partial range of motion, so when it's stretched, or short muscle length partial range of motion when it's near lockout, the person would see more growth with long muscle lengths, if that's all they were doing. In fact, I'm currently doing a meta-analysis on range of motion, which I got the results of in the past week or 2 now. And overall, the literature shows that long muscle lengths for partial range of motion do better than short muscle lengths. So if you're going to do partials, do them in a lengthened position. This is why I get confused sometimes when I see a certain crowd of bodybuilders online do partial range of motion in the shortened position. Like, I don't know, I've seen AJ Morris or Trained by JP, those sorts of people, and no beef with them. You know, they're people too. I don't have beef with them. But I see them do, first thing in a session, a shortened bias exercise, where they try and pick an exercise that's either a partial range of motion, but in the short muscle lengths, or that's really hard there. And I don't really understand the rationale that well. They claim it's because as the session goes on, it gets more difficult to reach that position. The only reason I can think of is because you have a pump. For example, for bicep curl, you can't get quite as high, but like I can't really think of anything decent there. But yeah, long story short, I think if you want to experiment with partial range of motion, do it at long muscle lengths. That's, for example, the bottom of a squat, which is why I think squatting deep, as far as technique goes, is one of the more important things for squats. Obviously, besides making sure that it doesn't hurt your joints. However, you might have, pre-existing injuries that cause you to have certain stances you prefer, or that sort of thing. But range of motion, I think, is one of the more important considerations for technique. And at this point, one of the more evidence-based ones, as opposed to certain things that people do that's less well studied, like for example, I don't know, pulse reps or banded squats or that sort of thing.
Have you seen the podcast on Revive Stronger, Mike Izricanje and Kasim? Have you seen the podcast?
I saw a very brief part of it. To be honest, nowadays when it comes to range of motion and muscle length training, I'm mostly just focused on literature because that's what I study. So when I see a podcast or something on it, I sometimes listen to parts of it because people recommend it to me sometimes, like a friend of mine recommended it to me. But for the most part, I just focus on my own reading of literature.
As I understood, the point was to do banded hex squats. So it's much more easier at the bottom. So reversed banded hex squats, sorry. So it's much more easier. And Mike made the point that that's like counterproductive in some ways. I kind of understood Mike's rationale because he explained it perfectly. But maybe Kasim was right. Maybe somehow some other mechanism we don't know. But why not do the bottom portion then, not the full range of motion, if you can maybe squeeze in much more volume, perhaps, or I don't know.
Indeed, and that's a good question. Honestly, that might just turn out to be correct. There might literally be a case for partial range of motion along muscle lengths. So in my meta-analysis, I can send you a graph later if you want that you can put up on the screen.
Okay, we'll do it.
Basically, we, like all meta-analyses, ran some very sort of rough analysis of, okay, on the whole, across all outcomes like muscle growth, strength, sports performance, power, all that stuff, is full range of motion better than partial range of motion? A sort of very rough analysis. But then what you can also do is analyze things case by case almost. So what we did was separate partial range of motion training into partial range of motion training at long muscle lengths and at short muscle lengths. So each study had a different protocol for partial range of motion. Some studies included partial range of motion when the muscle was more stretched out, whereas others when it was more shortened. And so what I did is for each study, I said, okay, this group used a partial range of motion at long or short muscle lengths. And then what you do is you analyze the data and say, okay, how does partial range of motion compare to full range of motion when it's either performed at long muscle lengths or short muscle lengths? And what you saw is that when partial range of motion is performed at short muscle lengths, it's worse than full range of motion. Not by much, but it's probably worse. Whereas when it's performed with long muscle lengths, it's actually potentially a decent bit better than full range of motion. Now, because there's not a ton of studies on this topic yet, I'm not going to go out and say, okay, let's do all of our training in the lengthened position. But I am now more open to stuff like, I don't know if you've seen this online, reverse drop sets. So I prefer calling them lengthened supersets. It's just a bit more intuitive. So what you do is you do a set with full range of motion. You can take it to failure. You can do it to RP8, RP7, whatever you want. And then instead of resting for a few minutes and going again, what you do is you keep the same weight or increase it a little bit or decrease it a little bit, whatever you need to do to get at least 5 reps again. And you do a partial range of motion, but long muscle lengths until you reach that same RP again. So for example, let's say you're doing machine rows. You do a set with full range of motion to failure. Then without rest, you decrease the weight by 10%. And then you do the bottom half of the range of motion until you reach failure again, and then you rest. And that's a lengthened superset. You superset a full range of motion set for an exercise with just a lengthened set, essentially. And we are actually planning to do a study on that, the first study on this sort of topic, eventually in the next few months/years. My suspicion is that out of all of the sort of commonly used intensity techniques like drop sets, or like giant sets, or like pre-exhaust, or like supersets for the same muscle group. Broadly speaking, none of those techniques have particularly good evidence for them. Like they just sort of all do the same job as regular straight sets. With this technique, I could see a potential for it doing better than just full range of motion sets, for example. So yeah, I'd be interested. Briefly coming back to the Coach Kasim argument about hack squats, there has actually been 2 studies now, I believe. I can recall one off the top of my head, and the second one, I believe, too, on matching the resistance curve to the strength curve and how that impacts hypertrophy. Long story short, those 2 studies didn't show any benefit for hypertrophy for doing that. So when I combine those 2 studies with my understanding of the long muscle length hypertrophy stuff, I'm very skeptical that banding a hack squat would necessarily be better. I'm going to assume it's as good or slightly worse. And when you add to that banding a hack squat takes more work as well, as in you need to, find the band and then attach it and stuff. And you then need to add more weight as well because it makes it easier. It's a lot more time investment for something that's maybe as good, but maybe even slightly worse. So to me, it just doesn't really add up.
I think that it's kind of worse because you can when you for example do 10 reps to failure, you can't go on the 11th rep, you can go to 90. So you have a little bit of let's say strength in the bottom portion. You can do another partial or maybe a lengthened superset. Yeah, I got that right. That was the argument of Mike saying it's counterproductive in some ways. and he basically said that, I think what you said, like it can be the same or maybe it's slightly better, but it's probably worse in some cases. But coming back to your PhD, when I first in the first podcast I said I'm going to invite you to the 101st. It's the 67th now, and when you talked about I'm making a PhD in the partial range of motion between full range of motion, I said, "Duh, you're gonna get the full range is better." But now we've seen a twist in the story that perhaps a little bit less range of motion in the lengthened position is maybe a little bit better. So it's kind of a cool twist.
Definitely, I think this kind of illustrates one of the problems you run across if you just look at individual studies. Sometimes, if you just look at individual studies and take them by themselves, and you just sort of read them without looking at the numbers specifically, you might come away with the understanding that full range of motion, oh, it's just better. But then when you take the numbers and you analyze them, you might find that actually there's not really a difference, or maybe it's actually the opposite. So, for example, the Brad-Schoenfeld's systematic review on range of motion and hypertrophy a few years back, it's a systematic review, which means you read each study and you say, oh, this is what they found, this is what this study found, this is what this study found. And then you say, okay, looking at all the results together, just reading them, this is probably better. And when you also look at the recent meta-analysis on range of motion that came out, I want to say like 6 months ago now, by Polaris et al., their analyses were only on lower body, for example, and they weren't able to extract that much data. So extracting data from studies basically means you take studies, you look at the results, and then you need to transcribe that data into your spreadsheet so you can analyze it afterwards. Oftentimes, because of how studies are reported, it's difficult to get that data out of it. For example, some people might not report standard deviations or standard errors or some data that you need to analyze the study. And so even sometimes when you email them, they might not longer have access to that data. They might have been, like I had studies that were conducted in 1990, back then they didn't pay much attention to how data was stored or preserved. So I didn't get access to that data. And the same probably happened to them. And furthermore, in that meta-analysis, they didn't run many sort of smaller analyses, like more specific ones, like the one I mentioned with muscle length. I also ran some with upper body versus lower body muscles. I also ran some regarding looking at muscle growth proximally and distally. So for example, for the biceps, proximally would be near the shoulder and distally would be near the elbow. And if you look at the regional muscle growth after partial range of motion training, for example, or different muscle lengths or full range of motion, typically you see that partial range of motion does a pretty good job of growing a muscle group proximally, so near the shoulder, for example, but then full range of motion and partial range of motion at long muscle lengths typically does better than partial range of motion at short muscle lengths at growing it distally. I'll explain. Let's say you're doing chest flies. If you're doing chest flies in only the shortened position, you might get pretty good growth proximally. So
where's proximally? So here's the attachment, and I can't. So here's the.
I think the origin is here, and the insertion is shoulder, because that's the closest to the center of the body. Mm-hmm. So you might get pretty good growth in your inner chest, quote unquote. But when you do full range of motion and partial range of motion at long muscle lengths, you might then get more growth compared to partial range of motion at short muscle lengths near to your shoulder, and that's why partial range of motion at long muscle lengths and full range of motion might be a bit better overall than partial range of motion at short muscle lengths. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, I totally understood everything you said, because I know what proximately and distally is.
Indeed.
One thing about this biomechanics thing, let's jump again back to the squat. When you put your feet like outwards and wide, you shorten the glutes. So when you go down, you have already shortened glutes and you can't stretch them. That's because that's one argument for biomechanically speaking, for making this more narrow stance.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sure. Mm-hmm. I think ultimately you don't shorten the glutes that much by just externally rotating your hips compared to like going from extended hips to fully flexed hips. It's a small difference, just like supinating your wrist doesn't do that much for your bicep length. But you can make that argument. Ultimately, we're looking at very broad findings. So whether there's a difference in the last 10% of muscle length, for example, and whether that's worth worrying about, we're not sure. Like, does it apply to that extent as well? Probably. And if you want to maximize results, it's worth looking at. But like, it's not clear that that relationship between muscle length and hypertrophy is for sure going to apply across the whole spectrum. So for example, once you reach 80% muscle length, that's when you're maximizing the sort of muscle length benefit, I guess. So maybe then you don't have to worry about externally or internally rotating your hip and how that impacts glute length, for example.
You made a good point about biceps. So for example, if you do biceps like this without supinating, it would be the same like with wide stance. But somehow, I don't know if I never kind of study this. I only do it like in the old bodybuilding.com forums. This hammer curl is more for the brachialis. I don't know if that's true. I think Jeff Nippert has a video about this.
Yeah. A lot of older Jeff Nippert videos are based a decent amount on EMG, which is fair enough. I wouldn't base my exercise selection on that necessarily, because you can find some really high EMG readings on exercises that aren't very good for growth at all. So yeah, I think, funnily enough, if you look at pull downs, for example, people always say, oh, chin ups train your biceps the most. But actually, if you consider the muscle length thing, if your wrist is supinated, you shorten your biceps. So if anything, from that perspective, you can say it's worse, and overhand pull downs are actually better.
We can always flip it. You can always say.
Indeed. But I think muscle length is, I don't know, I think it's interesting. I wouldn't be surprised, and this has been my hunch for the past like half a year now, that it turns out down the line that partial range of motion at long muscle lengths is actually as good or better than full range of motion. I wouldn't be that surprised, because there's a lot of surrounding literature and science that supports that idea, from the isometric training literature to the mechanistic literature around like, oh, if you stretch a muscle cell, it activates some pathways that cause growth. So it just makes some sense altogether, and I wouldn't be surprised down the line. And it's an interesting topic to study, I think.
Let's round this up. An upper body, your upper body range of motion is like always on the next level. Like when you do these pull downs, you go like kind of your traps are over your head, kind of.
Indeed, yeah. I think with pull downs, you probably do benefit from a full range of motion, because that's like at the top, because that's where you get a full stretch. This has also led me to revise my opinion a little bit on free weight pullovers for lats. Because while they are like essentially half range of motion at most,
in the bottom part,
you get a lot of tension down there, So yeah, who knows? Maybe they're good.
But do you lock your shoulder blades when you push, like or in bench press or machine press, shoulder press?
Honestly, it's really not a focus anymore. Like when I first started lifting and everyone was preaching about it, I probably learned it back then. But I don't worry about it. Like it's not my focus. Like it's never my focus. Whether I'm focusing on strength, at that point I'm more focused about, for example, a J bar path, or about being explosive, or whether I'm training for growth at the time being, where I'm more focused on potentially my muscle connection or bar speed again. It's never my focus to do that. And I think a lot of those assumptions aren't, same as for some back flexion during deadlifts, a lot of those assumptions aren't tested, and a lot of them are based on entirely separate discussions. Like, for example, the spinal flexion causing injury thing, could be the case. And if you want to bet on it, I'd probably bet for not doing it. But ultimately, it's so scarcely studied, that is to say, not studied at all in the context that we're talking about, that I wouldn't be like, oh no, you have to deadlift with a super straight back or otherwise you're going to die. If someone's been deadlifting for 5 years with a somewhat rounded back and they're fine, like I have some friends here that do, I'm not about to say, oh, change your whole deadlift technique. You can't deadlift more than 60 kilograms until you're able to do that,
Yeah, I kind of did these mistakes, like feed too much. I mean, mistakes. I don't know if they're mistakes, but I feel that this technique of doing full range of motion, I love, for example, talking about back, I love the assisted pull-up. it's such a good stimulant for my back, and I go down there, like below the ground with my knees. I had one machine. It's in this gym, and it's shit because you can't go down all the way. And this machine is beautiful, and as well as for example, these squats with feet more forward and narrow stance, and I have a much more stimulus for much less fatigue. It's better for me. So I love this style of training. I'm not gonna go to a bodybuilding show or something. I just want to stay in good shape, and this is kind of my favorite. It's always my favorite training. When I did 6 times a week, like full blown volume overload, it's the best kind of training. Now this is always, it's living in the moment, and I like that you're doing the same technique you said. It's much more comfortable to do these squats with this stance. You don't look much. It doesn't look that much comfortable when I see you doing a squat. It looks like, whoa, this is some brutal shit.
Yeah, I mean, it's comfortable in my joints, but it's not comfortable in my soul. You know? It's that sort of thing.
Milo, should we wrap it up? Like where can people find you? So this is the most sad sentence in the podcast at the end. Indeed. Where can people find you? Do you want something to round the discussion about range of motion? Maybe something that's on your mind, and then I'm gonna say my thanks for watching. Shit.
Indeed. Yeah. So to round it out, I think full range of motion, while it might not necessarily be much better for growth, still has a few benefits. It's easier to standardize, so you can track progress more easily over time, especially if you've been doing it for a while. I think it's a sort of safe bet for now. We're not sure yet whether long muscle length partial range of motion is better yet, so it's a fairly safe bet. If you want to experiment with partial range of motion, do it at long muscle lengths. That's it, pretty much. But overall, if you're just looking to get pretty jacked without worrying too much about it, don't worry if you're getting the extra half an inch at the very bottom of the squat. As long as you get a pretty good range of motion, you're probably fine. Now, as for where to find me, I'm going to now spend 17 minutes talking about this. Just go on Instagram, type in Wolf Coach. It's my last name, Wolf, like the animal, and Coach, and you'll find me. I have a ResearchGate where I do studies and stuff like that, where you can just type in MIlo Wolf. That's my full name, MIlo Wolf. I have a website, wolfcoaching.net, where you can find coaching stuff and some very old articles that I wrote. And I have a YouTube channel, which is called MIlo Wolf, very uninspiredly, I guess.
His name is really Wolf. So the links are going to be in the description for the YouTube, for the vlog, your website, for Instagram. And thanks for watching. Be nice to each other.